It's 3 o'clock and time to start our session. We have with us Hanna Bates. Hanna is the watershed coordinator for Prairie Rivers of Iowa. It's located here in Ames. She manages the Squaw Creek Watershed Water Quality Initiative Project, which is funded by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. And she will be presenting her analysis from her graduate work conducted last year at the Iowa State University Sociology Extension. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And so I'm here in two parts, here on behalf of Iowa State University Extension and then also the Water Quality Initiative Project. So if you're interested in reading more about that project, we have a poster out in the hallway with all the other Water Quality Initiative projects, in case you're interested. So today I'll be talking about the relationships between social networking factors in farming communities and the adoption of not just one or two conservation practices, but many conservation practices. So as we know, the Iowa agricultural economy relies predominantly on commodity production. We're the leading producers in corn, soybeans, hogs, you name it, we're the leader. And we're very proud of that too. But with this intensive agricultural system, it's very ecologically leaky as we're finding out essentially. Farm fields exist within drainage areas called watersheds that lead to major waterways and water bodies. And in the last several years, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution from fertilizer runoff has become increasingly evident. It contributes to hypoxic zones, local in Iowa and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico within the Mississippi River Basin. So in response to the growing need to address these issues, Iowa released a nutrient reduction strategy in 2013, which has a goal of a 41% reduction in nitrogen and a 29% reduction in phosphorus. And this assists the overall Mississippi River Basin goal of a 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus. But meeting these goals, as we're finding out, will take more than one conservation practices. There's no silver bullet. Only cover crops are not going to solve our water quality impairments. Only bioreactors. It'll take a suite of practices, as shown by work by Castellano and Helmers, McClellan, and Drinkwater, and numerous researchers are showing that we need a diverse set of conservation practices. The problem is that many studies over the last several years have focused only on the adoption of one practice, like a cover crop, or a series of practices, like conservation tillage, rather than a study was actually needed to address real-world problems that we're facing here in Iowa. So, of the previous research in nutrient management adoption, there are research shortcomings. Studies shows that the variables that have been consistent in predicting practice adoption are related to farmers' social networks. So this means who they're talking to, what format of information they are receiving, and who do they trust with the decisions that they make on their farms. Research in rural sociology indicates that these conservation practices that we're putting out are not so advantageous that they sell themselves, meaning they present no obvious economic or profitable value to the farmer. Rather, it takes education and influence from others to spur this adoption. So the studies that we reviewed over the last several years, some studies show that practices are adopted when farmer receives recommendations from a consultant, be that private or public. Other studies show that extension services, when they have adequate resources and are available to farmers, do have a positive relationship with conservation practice adoption. But other studies show that farmers often view university recommendations with uncertainty, which is seen here in Iowa and across the Corn Belt, and often opt for private recommendations from their ag retailers. But regardless of all of this, adoption is practice and farmer dependent, meaning it takes relationship building and trust with sources and time to see the practice work, both older practices like a cover crop or something new like a bioreactor, and see them at work on real farms. Also, studies seem to show that new technology adoption seems to exist on a bell curve. Earlier adopters or leading individuals, farmer champions in a watershed or in agriculture are key to encouraging others to mass adoption. So adoption is largely dependent on personal characteristics of the individual and their personality and how they're influenced by others. So from this literature review that we conducted, myself and Jay Arbuckle, we could develop the research question is, what is the relationship between social networks and the diversity in nutrient management practices used by farmers? So really this is asking and addressing the issue that we can't assume the adoption of one practice is like another. We need to understand the full scope of a practice adoption to meet Iowa goals. We can't assume that a farmer views cover crops the same way they view a bioreactor and will adopt them into their farm management practices. So to answer this question, we use 2012 Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll data. And this is an annual survey of Iowa farmers conducted through Iowa State Sociology Extension since 1982. It is the longest survey of its kind that's been running in the United States. The poll often focuses on ag policies, farming practices, quality of life in rural Iowa, what farmers' nutrient management practices are. It's a longitudinal study, so we can track trends over time since 1982. But as farmers retire, new farmers are added to the poll. And in 2012, we surveyed approximately 1,300 farmers, and we asked questions in regards to nutrient management practices and who they turn to for information. This is really in anticipation of the nutrient reduction strategy coming out in 2013. And of those 1,300 farmers, 996 were growing soybeans. So those are the focus of farmers that we were looking at in this study. So we ran ordinary least squares regression modeling to answer this question. Our dependent variable was a list of nutrient management practices. We provided a list of nutrient management practices, and the farmers indicated which ones that they used. We could turn that into an index. Our independent variables really were looking at both formats that farmers receive information as well as who they turn to for nutrient management. So in terms of preference for face-to-face formats, we looked at where farmers go, or what formats of information farmers preferred from Iowa State Extension, and this included field days and workshops as opposed to online media and publications. We looked at public sources of information, so Iowa State Extension Services, NRCS office, the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. We also looked at private resources, so your ag retailer, your crop consultant, your private agronomist, and also involvement in farm organizations. So we created an index of all the farm organizations that are within the state of Iowa. We asked farmers what level of involvement you have in those organizations, from member but not active to very involved. And we also wanted to examine opinion leadership within these farming communities as well. So we asked farmers a series of questions that sort of index their value of how they see themselves as a leader within their community. And lastly, we included just a typical economic variable to kind of test this one against the social networking factors to see if there's any difference in something like typical like farm size would have in terms of practice adoption. So this is a look at our dependent variable. These are practices farmers present reporting views of moderate to high. And this list isn't necessarily very surprising. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but the most popular practices used by farmers is something like crop rotation, yield goals, soil testing, things that have been long standards a part of decision making that farmers make as a part of their decision making, as well as conservation efforts. Whereas newer, more innovative practices such as use inhibitors, canopy sensors have a least amount of use. So you're seeing typically more older practices being more commonly used versus newer practices. In terms of farmer social networks, this is the distribution of information and educational programs offered through Iowa State and the preference for these farmers to use them. So a high amount of farmers, over 40% of farmers, prefer workshops, trainings, and meetings as a way to receive information. Second is field days. So then as we go down the list, the more technologically complex they were, the less likely farmers were to use them. And I'm sure as you all know in the room, the average age of the farmer is 50 to 60, so it's not likely they'd be using apps for a smartphone or a tablet to be able to access information on conservation or other nutrient management decisions. And then this is our percentage distribution for information sources farmers turn to first for nutrient management and fertilizer rate applications. The most popular sources are your fertilizer or ag chemical dealer, which over 60% prefer for nutrient management, over 60% prefer to go to their fertilizer or ag chemical dealer. For fertilizer application, that's over 80%. And as we go down the list, you see a huge drop here from your ag and chemical dealer down to Iowa State Extension. You have less than 20% reporting for nutrient management decisions. And then following next is your private consultant, your seed dealer, and then dead last you have your USDA NRCS office. And then this is the percentage distributions for farmer involvement in agriculture and natural resource conservation organizations. So this is those who are active to very actively involved, not just card-carrying members, but people who actually actively engage in these organizations. And the most common one is the Iowa Farm Bureau, reporting at 14%, followed by the Iowa Corn Growers Association, Soybean Association, Iowa Cattlemen's, Pork Producers, and then smaller and smaller groups is Practical Farmers, Iowa Farmers Union, etc. So the most popular ones, as you know, are the biggest organizations that we have in Iowa. And then lastly, this is a look at opinion leadership. So we created an index of those who responded to these questions on how they evaluated themselves and their community. So this is percent of, this was an agree, disagree, strongly disagree kind of question. So many farmers, about a quarter of farmers that we polled in this year, stated that when compared to other farmers, they tended to use more innovative management practices and strategies. So they viewed themselves, about a quarter of them saw themselves as very innovative. About 20% stated that their opinions mattered to the local agricultural community, so they saw themselves as saying that they have influence on others. And they also considered that about 15 to 20% consider themselves to be a role model for other farmers, so they see themselves as guiding behavior of the neighbors. And then about 50% said other farmers tend to look to them for advice, so that's a smaller number that they see themselves as providing a service to their community. Only about 10% actually take leadership roles in their ag community, and then 10% or less see themselves as providing advice to staff, extension staff, crop advisors, and others involved in agriculture. So they see themselves more as they look on themselves with something like this question, where they tend to use more innovative practices, so it's more self-reflective. When it comes to actually actively engaging with their community, it's actually a very small percentage. So of this, we developed 5 different hypotheses that examine face-to-face influence through field days and workshops, public versus private influence on practice diversity, examining social engagement through farm organization involvement on conservation practices, and examining how farmers see themselves as leaders in their community. And we were very positive, we were very optimistic with this, so we saw all of these different hypotheses having positive relationships. So farmers who see themselves, who prefer face-to-face information sources and have that face-to-face relationship with folks will use more practices. Farmers who go to public sources first for information, the prior literature shows that they will use more diverse practices, etc. So I won't read through all that because that's be painful for you, but but it's all positive. We're thinking happy. And the results kind of agreed with that, with us, fortunately. So I got to feel pretty smart about that. I was able to guess what was going to happen. So our results show that over 26% of the variation in the diversity of nutrient management practices is explained by variables in the model. With 26%, that doesn't sound great, but for social science research, that's actually pretty awesome. So in terms of information, in face-to-face formats, it does have a positive relationship with diversity and conservation practice adoption, and that result was significant, so we can make that statement. Public sector and private sector sources, unfortunately, was not found to be significant when we ran our analysis, so conclusions can't be drawn. And our perspective in regards to that was that maybe this question wasn't a robust enough measurement of this. We asked farmers what their preference was, not a ranking system or whether or not how highly they were influenced. So we're looking at adjusting that question in the future to actually measure public versus private, because those are 2 very important groups that are within farmers' social communities. We found farm organization involvement to be positive related to diversity in practice use. So the more involved farmers are in farm organizations, the more diverse practices they'll use. And in terms of opinion leadership, which actually this has significant weight and bearing on, it explains about 12% of the model, was that farmers who saw themselves as leaders use more practices. So farmers who are leaders can actually shepherd along this process and use more diverse practices. They can lead by example because they put in extraordinary efforts on their land. And then lastly, farmers who use more acres adopted more diverse practices too. So this is actually an indication of economies of scale in terms of practice use when looking at the number of acres versus diversity of practice use. And it kind of pushes us to re-examine the predominant myth that it's the larger farmers who are the most detrimental to the landscape, and that really they can do economies of scale. But it explains little in terms of the model as a whole in comparison to the other factors. Because the amount of farm acres versus diversity of practices only accounts for 1% of the model, whereas 25% of the model is accounted by social networking factors. So findings and conclusions. So it was a great study for me because everything we tested came out that we thought and actually showed positive relationships. So all these social networking variables that were found to be significant had a strong influence on conservation practice adoption. And in terms of format preference, one explanation could be generational effects. As I mentioned before, the average age of a farmer in Iowa is late 50s, early 60s. When you think of technology, I don't really see a 71-year-old farmer using hashtag plant16 on Twitter or, hashtag Clean Water Iowa out in the field taking pictures and posting things. So their predominant use of apps or online media to access this information or Google is not comparable to something like going to a field day, having a learning circle, going to a workshop to learn about these practices. So quality actually might be preferential to quantity and information delivery. That might not necessarily be the number of exposures or amount of exposures a farmer has to conservation practices and information, but the quality of information that's being put out and who is telling that story. So formats like a field day might be judged as more credible and have a higher impact on decisions. So this calls the question, like I said, are we currently generating content that is tailored to our farmer audience and is accessible? So as a watershed coordinator working over the last year, I present a lot of information on conservation, but frequently I get a request to actually see the practice happen in the ground. I took a couple weeks ago, I held a cover crop meeting in which I even had a farmer come and bring in a soil sample, show off his earthworms, talk about the practice. And I did call-ups and followed up with these farmers later that attended the meeting, and they're like, well, that was great, and I learned a lot. But I need a field day before I'm convinced. I need to go talk to the farmer and see it at work. So that's something that might be worth considering for people doing this kind of work. In terms of farm organization involvement, as you can see, organizations, as you typically know, consist of goals, leaders, structures, and support membership experimentation and creativity. Farm organizations like Practical Farmers and Iowa Soybean Association have networks for research in which they're allowing farmers to be creative and experiment on their farms. So really you're creating farmer scientists to understand real-world application and implementation of these practices. And this data shows that that's actually has a positive correlation. So the more community you build, the more freedom you allow for farmers to try these practices on their farms, the more likely that they would adopt more diverse practices. And then in terms of opinion leadership, farmers who see themselves as leaders use more diverse practices. So we should put more emphasis on helping opinion leaders who have more diverse nutrient management practices to use their skills to influence other farmers on nutrient management. And actually, I kind of have a funny story from my work as a watershed coordinator. So lately I've been in the habit of having pancakes at 6 a.m. at a farmer's shop, and it's a well-respected farmer in the area. And he just cooks up pancakes in his shop, and all the farmers from the area just come in, sit down, have pancakes, talk shop, talk whatever, and leave. And they're building a community, and they're building a community around this leader, this well-respected person. So, of course, I show up, which I almost couldn't show up, so I was talking about this with a few folks earlier, but this guy was so nervous about bringing me, because I was a watershed coordinator, talking about conservation practices, that he wouldn't even tell me the address of this farm. I had to meet him at Casey's and pick me up. And I was like, what, you want to blindfold me too? Like, what is this? So there's a lot of trust going on there. So I hopped in anyways, and we went over and had a couple meetings. And then last week I finally revealed I'm like, well, I'm a watershed coordinator. Like, not just some stranger showing up to your farm. Like, I can talk conservation practices a little bit to you and stuff. I'm not here to tell you what to do. Give you recommendations and talk about all the positive qualities from doing your farm. So with the help of this respected person in the community, I'm able to do outreach and talk to others in the community who normally wouldn't walk into my office requesting a conservation practice. So opinion leadership can be very powerful when it comes to adoption of these practices. So one last slide for you guys. So I just kind of want to leave you with some questions as informed by our research is, are we reaching farmers through the right sources of information? Are we engaging the community in the ways that we want to? Are we expecting the revolutionaries overnight to come to us wanting conservation, or are we coming to them to the sources that they trust through information formats that they understand and that they want? Are we using information sources? So are we using information sources farmers already know and trust? And are we using the right signals that resonate with farmers for long-term conservation efforts? So not thinking about 5 years down the line, but are they adopting conservation practices that will stay on their farm with their children and grandchildren 50 years from now? So this engagement in community outreach is often being conducted at the watershed level with the Water Quality Initiative demonstration projects, Squaw Creek being one that I manage in the Ames area. And these projects emphasize connecting outreach and developing a conservation model that fits a farmer's social role, rather than expecting to revolutionize over a short period of time. The Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy was released in 2013. People are already expecting dramatic results. It's only been 3 years. So using these sort of social engagement methods can slowly bring farmers to where we need to be for conservation. And this is done by providing, as I said, information sources that they use, engaging, and getting more respected individuals in the community to speak up and talk about their practices. These projects, these water quality initiative projects, also emphasize demonstration, so showing off the practices as they're implemented by first-time users. And it really places farmers in the driver's seat of decision making and engages multiple influencers on adoption. So these sorts of looking at farmers' social factors and social community is actually putting them in the decision-making seat and making them the proponent for agriculture. Because often, like, I just sit up here in front of farmers and tell them everything, but I mean, it's really up to the farmers to make that decision themselves and listening to others on it. So overall, social networking factors may be a key influencer in order to achieve goals set out in the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, especially with the need for diverse practices. As we know, there's no silver bullet to impairments in Iowa, but it will take engagement, education, and technical assistance to develop long-term solutions. So these social networking factors that I laid out for you engage with who farmers are in their communities and the services they may provide beyond the crops that they produce. Any questions?
About the power of field days as being influencing farmers' behavior. So the organizations that have field days like Iowa Learning Farms or PFI, other organizations, you feel those are effective ways to get information out?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I have polling data with farmers saying that they find those to be more credible sources than reading a research report or data. You can always argue against a study that was done on cover crops that you can say, well, this was in an isolated condition and a perfect scenario. Whereas if you take a farmer out to someone else's farm, they will show you the webs and the cobwebs up on the ceiling, as well as the things that do work, and be honest about what works for them. So I think seeing in the real world application anecdotally as a watershed coordinator has a powerful effect.
How do you gain access to the leaders? Like you were saying, it does sort of take that leadership. How you were giving your story about gaining that trust.
Yeah.
How did you reach that person?
It was through getting to know. So I navigate a lot of areas, so like soil and water conservation. I'll do the acronyms if everyone can understand me. SOUCD commissioners. It was by word of mouth from them that I got to know this individual. So it was like someone who knows someone who knows someone who can validate that I'm not there to impose rules or push some sort of agenda, and that I'm an okay person was allowed me to kind of get into that avenue. It makes my Thursdays very tiring. Yes.
Hannah, the original study that's done every year from 2012,
Mhm.
does that track like owner versus owner-operator versus tenant? Or is that only sent out to the farm, the actual land owner?
It's sent out to owner-operator from my understanding, so those who are actively working on the farm.
This is 3-year-old data. Do you think some of us have changed since then?
I think so. If you run really fast, you can go to Jay's presentation over in the other room with 2014 data. But I mean, this was to understand really a baseline of where we were at pre-nutrient reduction strategy, to kind of know what farmers were doing in the first place, basically to understand where we're at and where we need to go in terms of who we should be reaching out to for information sources and what practices farmers were already doing.
So what kind of things are you finding are the hardest to deal with when you try to present new information that farmers are putting up as reasons why they're not, not interested or not wanting to believe you? What sort of things are, are you running into as justifications that people are using?
Well, I often say, I mean, speaking as a watershed coordinator, not as farmful, but they see it, but when to really understand it, they actually need to see it happening out in the landscape. Talk to someone who has that experience for it, because they say to me as someone who sits in an office that studies this or talks about it, but I'm not a farmer. I don't have that wealth of experience that someone else would have in having successes and challenges, because they want to know both what is good about a practice and what won't work. And we don't want to hide what is a challenge with practice either. You want to emphasize both the good and bad and have them make a solid, well-educated decision.
Yeah, so at all the land-grant institutions, or at least at UW-Madison, there is the short course. So the new generation of farmers, they come in, and they're learning the reasons why X and Y and Z work, and they're taking it back to influence on their own lives. Do you have anything suggesting like attitudes towards the kids that come back and try implementing these things on their own?
Yeah. So this is actually part one of a 2-part study that I conducted last year. So this part was looking at 2012 data in survey data in terms of where we were baseline. But I moved on in understanding the value of opinion leadership, and I moved on to a second study in which I interviewed a group of farmers about what motivates them to be an opinion leader within their community, what motivates them to do these practices in the first place and put in extraordinary efforts. And a significant portion of them actually said it was my son or daughter who came back from learning these things, either at a land-grant university or other groups, and brought this heightened technology back to the farm and taught the older generation on the farm how to use them. So that information more so comes out in qualitative data than something you can ask in a survey. But that definitely was something there as a way to motivate and promote conservation practice adoption.
Forgive me if I didn't hear you cover this, but I took it from a slide that was up there that there was no statistically significant difference between the preference for private sector
Yes.
information sources versus public sector information sources.
Mm-hmm.
Am I interpreting that right?
Yes, yeah, so we can draw any conclusions between the relationships between practice adoption and then those 2 information sources. And we determined based off of looking at how the question was designed that it wasn't a robust enough measure to be able to draw significance and to make that statistical relationship between those 2 things.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And that's the only bummer of all my very positive hypotheses I came up for the study. Those 2 I couldn't say anything about. Any other questions? Yeah.
In dealing with your expertise with your local landowners out there, it's simple. I'm looking for just the answer to one question. That's why farmers aren't adopting the cover crops more now. Based on
Well, often,
see evidence of that yet?
I mean, a little bit. I mean, right now, cost is a little bit of a factor right now with how crop prices are to be able to spend some money on putting a cover crop out in the ground. But with the water quality initiative projects, we offer cost share to help defray that cost. So it's knowing what sources and information or financial assistance is available, and then also getting farmers to think sort of long term about what that cover crop is going to do for them 4 or 5 years down the line. And it might be a little bit of a trade-off now, but what they'll get in the end from having a cover crop, you'll have yield increases, you'll have protection against high rainfall events. I mean, it's getting them to consider the long-term use of these conservation practices rather than the next 4 or 5 years. So often I ask them, like, are you farming for the next 5 years, or are you farming for the next 50 for your children or grandchildren? Because often I never hear farmers saying, well, I'm going to farm for the next 5 years, I'm going to retire, I'm going to be done, and I don't care who gets my land next. I never hear farmers say that. They're like, I'm building this operation, I'm building my family legacy to pass on to future generations. So it's kind of getting around that idea too, to promote these conservation practices. Sorry, that was a very long answer. Yes.
But looking at where they get their sources of information, has anyone ever looked at their perceived risk? One of the reasons farmers don't adopt things is that they're more concerned about the downside risk of the technology than the upside. It's just sort of human nature. I don't think that gets factored into the decision-making process or evaluation of the decision-making.
Yeah, risk perception. Yeah, I mean the understanding what's real and perceived risk on these conservation practices really, I mean, that is reliant on who they're talking to, what quality of information they are receiving, and the
isn't that sort of the root of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there was no measurement of real or perceived risks in terms of who these folks were talking to for their nutrient management decisions within this poll, so I can't really comment on that per se, but if we look in other years, there might be more questions in regards to that, but I mean, for this analysis, I can't comment on that.
I mean, in our field, in my field, I often hear people that, I mean, they talk up the private sector as a trusted source of information. I grew up on a farm, I've never gathered that they're really that trusted. Farmers are always skeptical, for good reason, of any source of information that they're getting. One of my colleagues said that they have very sensitive BS meters. And it'd be interesting to see some more research into that, into the concept of risk and how people can deal with that better. I think if you lowered the risk of trying new things, it would be a great thing.
I mean, just like looking at this graph without like including it within that regression modeling, just looking at this as it is. I mean, as a watershed coordinator or anyone who's involved in water quality work, this is a wealth of opportunity right here to get conservation on the agenda. Because with your ag, fertilizer, or chemical dealer, because this is who farmers are going to first for those decisions. So it's part of their routine to go to the co-op, to buy their seed, et cetera, to go through all these other services. So why not help put conservation on the agenda as well? And that's part of the work I'm doing as a watershed coordinator, is taking the ideas, not the ideas, but the results from these studies and applying them within my watershed. So I'm working with all the local co-ops, getting ag retailers in my area trained on our conservation programming so they know to talk about it with the farmers. So after they talk about what herbicide they're going to buy or how much pounds of them they're going to buy per acre, it's let's talk about cover crops too. Let's talk about how this fits into your holistic management of your farm that we're talking about, rather than just isolating it, talking about management practices versus conservation.
But I'm sure they're skeptical of the ag and chemical dealers' information, because after all, those guys are going to tell them you ought to use less of our product. You know, that they understand that that's probably not going to happen. So I think extension has a role to play in providing unbiased information. And I don't hear that discussed as much. I understand. I think what you suggested is a good idea, but I know that farmers don't completely trust those dealers because they understand what the game is. And it's, you know.
But then those ag retailers too see the scope of what's happening within the state of Iowa too, and see all the political things, legal action that's kind of occurring, you know. So I mean, everyone has their motivations to partake in this, for different reasons. So it's just kind of engaging, seeing where these farmers are at and going to them rather than expecting them to come to us for conservation, because historically it's shown that the people who need it most aren't the people who are going to be walking towards you asking for these practices.
Great, all right, we need to give people time to move to another session, so let's thank Hanna